Hi, everyone. My name is Annie Rogers, and on behalf of the ADDitude team, I am pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled How Mindfulness and Meditation Build Emotional Regulation in People with ADHD. Leading today's presentation is Dr. Mark Bertin. Dr. Bertin is a developmental pediatrician and author of several books, including How Children Thrive, Mindful Parenting for ADHD, and Mindfulness and Self-Compassion for Teen ADHD, all books that integrate mindfulness into pediatric care. Dr. Bertin is a faculty member at New York Medical College and the Windward Teacher Training Institute, and he has served on advisory boards for us, as well as APSARD, the Screen Time Action Network, Common Sense Media, and Reach Out and Read. His blog is available through Psychology Today. Dr. Bertin also leads workshops and retreats that combine mindfulness and practical support for families and professionals. You can join him for a special event, a workshop called Held and Whole, a restorative ADHD retreat rooted in nature, and that's taking place October 10th to 12th. In New York. And for more information, you can find it in developmentaldoctor.com. We also wanted to make you aware that you can join Dr. Bertin as well as Drs. Roberto Olivardia, Ari Tuckman, and Stephanie Sarkis in New York City or around the world virtually this coming Friday, September 26th. It's an all-day educational event for educators and parents of children with ADHD. It'll cover executive functions, comorbid conditions, social and emotional concerns, and helpful interventions. And it is an event being brought to you by the Churchill School in New York City, as well as ADDitude. You can learn more about that event and get your name on the wait list by scanning the QR code that you see on your screen now. We'd also like to begin today's webinar by asking a poll question to our live audience. We would like to know, if you've tried practicing mindfulness in the past, what has gotten in the way of your success? Please select all the applicable answers and comment in the text box under the video player to tell us a bit more. This will help to guide our Q&A session at the end. For answers to common webinar questions about slides, transcripts, and certificates of attendance, you can click on that FAQ tab of your webinar screen at any time. And you should know that the ADDitude team is hard at work on our fall 2025 issue. It is our annual Success at School issue. It also has content on ADHD and sleep, resistant adolescence, and the science of boredom. You can sign up now and get 15% off ADDitude, as well as the ebook, How the ADHD Brain Works. You just need to enter the code, you can click on the link on your screen to get started today. And we got one more thing for you. We have an ebook that is called Complementary Approaches to Managing ADHD, and it does cover, among other things, mindfulness. So you can get 20% off of that book by using the code MINDFUL at checkout, and you can see that information on your screen as well. Lots of goodies today. Finally, before we get started, the sponsor for today's webinar is Inflow. Living with ADHD can feel like an emotional roller coaster. Inflow gets it. Their science-backed program, developed by ADHD experts, teaches mindfulness techniques tailored for ADHD brains, so you can learn to pause, process, and respond instead of reacting. Build emotional regulation skills, create calmer routines, and take back control. Click the link on your screen to take the free ADHD traits quiz to get started. ADDitude thanks our sponsors for supporting these webinars. Sponsorship has no influence on speaker selection or webinar content. Okay, with all that out of the way, I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Mark Bertin. Dr. Bertin, thank you so much for joining us and for leading this discussion on mindfulness and emotional regulation.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I always appreciate the opportunity. And obviously, anyone who knows me knows I love covering this topic. So what I'd like to do now is, well, first I'm supposed to say I have no disclosure, so I'm not earning anything directly for doing anything for today's talk. So my goal today, it's interesting what the poll is today on, what are the hurdles to mindfulness? There's plenty of hurdles to mindfulness. My goal today is to kind of normalize the concept of mindfulness, really within the basket of a larger concept of kind of called contemplative practice, which is just the recognition that anything that we practice repetitively becomes more habitual. And that applies for all of us, with or without ADHD. So most of you have probably noticed that if we don't put a little effort into it, the world kind of knocks us off balance into a lot of distraction and reactivity and habitual ways of living and habitual ways of communicating. And my goal today is to just make it very accessible and common sense and really realistic to recognize that if we choose to practice mindfulness, or a couple of related practices I might touch on, we really support all of long-term well-being. And very specifically, when it comes to ADHD, we can acknowledge that since emotional dysregulation is part of ADHD, anytime that we're caught up in emotion and off balance, it's hard to do all the other things we need to do in life. So that if we can start from a foundation of well-being and self-regulation, and I'm going to touch on the idea of self-compassion, that kind of makes managing all the rest of ADHD much easier and actually just makes people feel better. The core framework, I think, for addressing any part of ADHD is understanding it as a disorder of executive function. And that's not what I get to go into in much detail today. But I would say that personally, I find Thomas Brown's breakdown into 6 parts of ADHD, as much as I love all the gurus and experts in this field, this 6-part self-management breakdown that we have to manage attention, we have to manage our actions. Sometimes as parents, I kind of shorthand it like anything you can put the word management to probably involves executive function. This is a really practical and hands-on way of seeing ADHD. So if someone has ADHD, it's very individual, but there is some pattern of a difficulty with executive function causing their challenges. Now, one of the things I think that has become more of the discussion lately, but is still under-discussed, is that emotional self-regulation, emotional management is inherently part of that. And since emotions are part of our everyday life, people with ADHD are often experiencing more extremes of emotion that certainly begin to impact how they think, how they problem solve, how they relate to other people. And this emotional piece isn't always addressed through more traditional practices, or longer term established practices in ADHD. Another thing I think that's very vital to recognize around ADHD is that since it's a life management disorder, it causes a lot of stress. I mean, stress is part of life for all of us, and anyone who is a little familiar with mindfulness knows that we're not looking to eliminate stress in life. Some degree of stress is motivational. Clearly, when chronic stress takes over, that affects our emotional and physical health, affects how we feel, and then begins to affect other things too. So when people are overwhelmed with stress or just caught up in stress all the time, and the emotional reactivity, that's both part of stress and part of ADHD, that doesn't affect just individuals, that affects the people around them. So this would go for spouses too, but certainly in my field of developmental pediatrics, the reason I initially started integrating mindfulness into ADHD care was because I thought it was terribly underappreciated that the parents and caretakers of kids with ADHD were really struggling in many different ways. It's hard stuff to manage. No one, it's obviously very stressful when your kids are struggling. Your kids are delayed almost literally in independence. The skills that go into independence, the skills that define the word maturity, are very much executive function based, leads to struggles with decision-making, struggles in relationships, struggles really in all the things that help us feel resilient. And then of course, managing ADHD itself requires a lot of resilience. You might think for a moment, like the basic framework of a behavioral plan in everyday life, that's difficult to do, but easy to describe. And, the problem solving out can be really challenging, but certainly one of the things that undermines our ability to follow through with some complicated behavioral plan that an expert's recommending we do is when we get swamped emotionally, or when we're too stressed and don't have the energy to do it. So even though in the long run, that behavioral plan clearly would make things feel better, in the short run, if we don't start with managing stress and emotion, we might not have the energy to get there. So with or without ADHD, with ADHD, you often have bigger emotions and increased stress. But with or without ADHD, I think we're all aware of the fact that undermanaged stress and emotion have cognitive effects. You might take a moment to just reflect on the fact if you were so lucky as to have like a full month vacation handed to you and then came back and someone handed you some problem, you'd handle it very differently than if you were 1 month into one of the most chaotic, stressful times you've ever had in a family or work and someone handed you the same problem. So when stress and emotion take over, that decreases the efficiency in our problem solving, increases our reactivity and thinking, pushes us more into habitual ways of doing things, sort of an autopilot. It's very hard to think flexibly when we're under that degree of stress. Quite often in life in general, and certainly if we don't take this broader approach to ADHD care, we're not fully acknowledging that. And the thing about emotions is that they're influencing how we think and feel, whether or not we choose to have them there. The steering wheel there is a reminder for me to sort of use the analogy of emotions are driving the bus quite often, whether we want them to or not. They're there, they're impacting how we're thinking about things, they're impacting how we feel. And all of that is going to change what happens next. And there's a broader concept within the umbrella of contemplative practice, which isn't really for today's topic, but is quite an important one, which is we can never still our mind completely. I'll touch on that in a moment. And we're never going to be perfect in any particular way. But we have to acknowledge that kind of one thing leads to another. The way we think about things influences how we problem solve them, or the way we act towards other people influences how they act back towards us. And while we will all remain highly imperfect about how we manage that, there's an awful lot of value to working on the skills that allow us to stay more intentional and in touch with our best decision-making more often. That's because the one last thing I want to say about that is this, which I think I just touched on, is that's because it's not really even just our own inner world. It's how we communicate with our children. It's how we communicate with our spouses. So we're trying to promote a certain way of living, but then we're caught up in reactivity, and then we say that thing that triggers them to say that thing. And then we get reactive. And I was just talking to a family this morning that was talking about how, in the big picture, they're they know they're just this loveliest couple to hang out with. And yet when their child gets all reactive, they find themselves yelling quite often. But no one who's yelled at in life actually ever calms down. They just yell back. So it's really not helping manage the situation at all. And then over the long haul, and then I want to move on to what we're going to do about it, we need to acknowledge that even though stress is part of life and we're going to have our moments where we lose it emotionally, when it takes over, it overall begins to decrease our well-being, decrease our resilience, decrease our ability to persist in life. And that directly affects ADHD care. Everything about ADHD care requires resilience and persistence over time. It's hard stuff. We have to, I usually break up my interventions for ADHD when I'm trying to coordinate something that's individualized into 4 areas of life, each of which are challenging. You have to work with school systems. The behavioral plans at home seem like they, should be straightforward on paper, but very rarely are in terms of building executive function and managing behavior and getting on top of healthy sleep and exercise. And certainly the medical decision-making can be really hard. And there's no yes, no answers. It all needs to be tried and problem solved. And it can really just begin to feel overwhelming. So to get a handle on this, almost like anything else in life, if we can work on resilience and emotion first, it sort of potentiates all the rest of it. And that's really the premise for why contemplative practice is something anybody can work on and get value from, because we're never going to shut off our minds. That's not the goal, but we can all learn how to manage our emotions a little differently and manage stress a little differently. So certainly part of the reason people quit when they are hearing this word like mindfulness or hearing they're going to practice mindfulness is simply that they have an impression of it that's totally off base. So the slide might be very small depending on the device you're looking at there, but basically it's a guru-like looking guy on a platform, and in the back of him there's a sign that says the journey to enlightenment, whatever that is, and the person in the audience is saying, are we there yet? So if you have this perfectionistic view of mindfulness, like every time I meditate, I should relax, or every time I meditate, my thoughts should go away, you're probably going to quit on mindfulness really pretty much right away, because you're never going to get there. Mindfulness is really beginning to explore the implications of this slide, which is that our mind is doing something all the time, and our mind is distracted all the time with or without ADHD. It may be more intense with ADHD, but we're doing one thing and our mind is off somewhere else. And as much as that is inevitable, the promise of mindfulness isn't laser sharp focus, it's awareness. And we need to be aware of the fact that there actually, in spite of the fact that it's inevitable, there are implications to it. So we're doing one thing and we're thinking of another, then we're not giving full attention to that task, or we're not giving full attention to our child. Or there's research suggesting that our minds, when they drift into the past or future, tend to think of stressful thoughts of the past or future. So we're experiencing something difficult and then we're amplifying it. It's something called the second arrow. It's challenging, and then the story we're telling about it makes it even more challenging. Or we're doing something that we could be enjoying, except we're not even paying attention to it because something stressful takes over. So we don't even get to really enjoy it because we're not even there fully. So the implications of awareness are just beginning to recognize that while this is inherently part of life, we can't actively experience something without giving it our full attention, whether we want to handle a problem or just enjoy our coffee. And also, we can't change and be intentional in our choices unless we're given active attention to what's actually going on in that moment. It also has very specific implications when it comes to stress. And one thing I haven't said yet, by the way, one of my favorite teachings around all this, that as I get into like how to actually practice or why to actually practice, I'd like you to pay attention to, is a very core teaching around this is be a skeptic. Like ask yourself, is this true? Is this true for me? And would it be valuable for me to work on something different? So I want you to think about that as I'm talking. When you look at the stress cycle itself, the stress response developed because of what's being shown in the slide. Like we need these moments where we have to take care of ourselves. It's often called the fight or flight response, but often even expanded to the fight, flight, or freeze response, meaning in these moments of intense stress, our bodies are gearing up to either run or fight. But also in those moments of intense crisis, we're not supposed to think clearly. So we kind of freeze too. It's like our brain shut down. It's all about action. In the modern world, most of the time, we're not being chased by a lion. You know, what's triggering the stress response is a fear like, I might have said that wrong, or, you know, she's looking at me funny, or I'm going to be late. That triggers exactly the same response. But one of the things that's important to start exploring is it also creates a vicious cycle. Because when we're caught up in stressful thoughts, it changes how we feel, which changes how our body feels. And when our body feels off, that changes our emotional state, and our emotional state changes the filter through which we think about things. And it can be like shaking a snow globe all day long. Something pushes us into stress or makes us feel off balance, or several things do, and then we're just caught up in it indefinitely. And one of the most important beginning reframes of what mindfulness practice is or isn't is just getting into the routine of noticing this cycle and pausing long enough to let the snow globe settle, pausing long enough, getting the routine of catching ourselves and doing some type of activity that lets us settle again. The teacher, a wonderful teacher named Sharon Salzberg, sometimes advocates people to do small doses many times a day. You know, just as often as you can just start getting into this new routine, just break the cycle so you can start seeing with more clarity and acting with more clarity. One of the most, I think, wonderful messages of all of contemplative practice, all of mindfulness practice, is that when we're settled, we will mostly all of us make better choices, right? We all have the capacity to do that if we build the ability to stay intentional. So I've used the word mindfulness a lot already, and I want to define it so that we can all be on the same page of what we're talking about, because that also is not what everyone thinks necessarily. The concept is not about meditation specifically. Meditation is like a gym program. So when we meditate, our minds may stay busy and we may be bored and restless. And really, that's all part of the practice. That's a good thing. We're learning to live with that type of discomfort in a different way. And we can certainly look at emotions through that same lens in a moment. So the practice of meditation isn't something you can do well or do poorly at all. If you set your intention, it's really just a practice of trying to develop these traits you've identified for yourself And mindfulness is therefore more of a way of living, aiming to give more moment to moment. There's several components to it. And you can ask yourself, like, when would it not be valuable to be aware of what's actually going on? I mean, it's nice to avoid pain sometimes, but it's not. And there are times in life that's important, for specific, very limited reasons usually. But if we actually want to handle something well, we have to give it our full attention. If something positive is going on, we need to give it our full attention to experience it. So it's aiming to more often, more intentionally give full and kind and compassionate awareness, which I'm going to end on today. I'll explain what that means at the end, without our typical filters, like not avoiding things, not hiding from things, just this is what's actually going on in this moment, for better or worse. So that's the goal of mindfulness practice. So mindfulness doesn't specifically mean anything more or less than that. And we can even be aware of the fact that, like, I'm feeling really distracted now, and that has value. An example I use around ADHD quite often is if you're just someone who's totally distracted trying to have a conversation in a busy, noisy space, the practice of mindfulness doesn't necessarily, or probably doesn't mean that you're, through repetition, are so focused you don't have that problem anymore. Compassionate awareness might be having the self-confidence and self-awareness to say, you know what, this is a really important conversation to me. Let's step outside and have it somewhere quieter. And that might be acting with mindfulness. It's important to sort of throw away some of the misunderstandings if you're going to stick with practice as well, because mindfulness doesn't mean many of the things people are afraid of. It doesn't mean you're okay with everything. The word acceptance gets used a lot, but that just means we can't change everything. It doesn't mean we accept it and we're happy about it. It just means we see it clearly. So if we're clear when we're practicing mindfulness, we make better choices when it's time for a proactive decision. It doesn't mean sitting still. You can do movement practices. It doesn't mean our mind ever stops. We can just learn to manage and relate to our thoughts differently, but our minds stay busy. And unpleasant things are still going to happen, but we just live with them a little differently when we practice. So once when you start talking about mindfulness, it's important to just do it. So I'm going to lead a practice in just a moment to try to normalize it and make it accessible to people. But I do think one of the most fundamental reframes you can do around mindfulness that'll help you stick with long-term practice is recognize you can just let go of any premise of doing it right, doing it wrong, stopping thoughts, as I've said several times already, and really reframe it as a practice of building awareness and patience. Because it's a very unique experience to spend maybe 10, 12 minutes, whatever you decide to start with, 5 minutes, it doesn't matter initially. And it's giving yourself permission to just sit and observe. And unless your hair is actually on fire, allowing yourself to notice what's ever happening without all your typical habits. It's an exploration of like, oh, right now I'm feeling anxious and I'm not going to do my anxious habit. Or right now I'm feeling hungry, and normally when I'm hungry, I do this, but right now I can just sit here until my practice ends, or I'm angry, or I'm happy and joyful, whatever it is you happen to notice. You're trying to build the ability to be aware of it with a sense of patience, with a sense of responsiveness. And that's what begins to spill over into everyday life. And that's the initial intention. And clearly that's anybody can do, because imperfection is just part of life. So we're basically, instead of, as I started today, staying caught up in the reactivity and stress and old habits and old patterns that just life pushes us into, the autopilot of everyday life, the assumptions we make, the habits we've developed, stress is going to happen. And, through these practices, we can train ourselves to relate to things a little more skillfully, a little more intentionally. And that is really the long-term goal. But that's a lot of words to describe something that's actually an experience. So before I transition into specifically how this relates to emotion in a moment, I just want to lead a very brief practice for all of you. It doesn't matter if you've done this before. And as I do this, I want you to notice there's probably an initial cognitive habit that happens. I hate this. I love this. I'll never do this. This sounds quacky, whatever it is. Those are the thoughts you're having. But I would tell you, this is something anybody could practice. So I would encourage you, notice the thought and come back to the practice. And that is the practice in essence. So find yourself a comfortable posture, and we're going to do a very brief practice right now. Just notice your posture for a moment. See if you can find yourself a kind of balanced posture, just because it's easier to stay a little more still that way. So find something that feels upright, kind of alert, but at ease at the same time. Sort of a middle ground of not feeling too tense, not pushing yourself too hard. You can't force anything to happen here, and not being too lazy. And then you might begin to notice that there is a physical sensation your body makes with each breath. And there too, there's nothing magical we're trying to make happen. It's simply that anytime you're paying attention to something physical like that is a moment you become aware. It's a moment you've stepped out of thoughts and emotion and all the rest again. So our breath is just kind of an anchor for awareness. So you might begin to use a mental label of something like aware I'm breathing in and aware I'm breathing out. And see if you can reframe things a little bit. Since your mind is going to stay busy, it isn't a failure when you've become distracted in any way. It's a moment of clarity and awareness if even once or twice you come back to the next breath. Aware I'm breathing in and aware I'm breathing out. So just for another minute or so, seeing if you can stay aware of whatever is happening, busy mind, restless body, and as best as you're able, notice that and simply come back to the next breath. And when you're ready, opening your eyes and bringing your awareness back to our virtual classroom. So how does this apply directly to emotion? I do think as we transition to the nitty-gritty of mindfulness and emotion, I hopefully I've set it up so you get a sense of what we're talking about already. You can begin to see that this emotional component of ADHD, which isn't as directly affected by really many of the other interventions, depending on how you look at them. The medications help a ton with ADHD, not always with emotion. I even am a huge advocate of cognitive behavioral therapy and all the different values it has. But on some levels, it's describing what you need to be doing. But mindfulness is the activity of training yourself to develop emotional awareness and management skills directly. There's a difference there. This is actually like the gym program that teaches you how to do it. The emotions, as I said before, are going to keep coming and going. So how can we use these practices to develop a fuller emotional vocabulary and emotional awareness skills? So there's a lot to be said just about managing emotions in general. And for today's talk, I'm going to be focusing on the contemplative practice piece of it. But I did want to mention a few of the larger framework of things because a lot of people had a lot of questions about working with kids or developing emotional awareness in general. One of the key concepts is we can look at how we're modeling and discussing emotion in any situation, either as a family or as an adult, how we're exploring it. Because I just wanted to very quickly bullet point 3 or 4 things that go into general emotional self-management skills before moving into the mindfulness part specifically. One thing is there are several researchers who have been looking into the fact that the more complex emotional vocabulary, the more nuanced ability we have to describe our emotional world changes our emotional experience. Brene Brown's an emotional researcher who, in one of her surveys, pointed out that many people really are putting everything to the basket of happy, sad, or angry in life, even though obviously there's dozens and dozens of nuanced emotions that you can look at around that. And that ability to say, like, I'm not actually angry so much as I'm frustrated, or, I'm actually not angry, I'm worried, or whatever it is. The more nuance we get with that changes how we interpret and manage our emotions, as well as the fact that, research has said that when we can verbally express our emotions, that tends to tone them down too. So in raising kids or as an adult, the more we can help normalize that all emotions just happen. They're all okay. It's the behaviors we attach to the emotions that aren't always okay. helps manage emotions in and of itself. For anyone working with kids, it is important to acknowledge that just managing ADHD thoroughly helps with emotional self-management skills. So the medications can help, and parent training programs actually can help teach kids how to manage their emotion, and cognitive behavioral therapy can help manage emotion. But fundamentally, as an adult, as a parent or teacher, it's how we model and interact with emotion that's going to influence kids profoundly in and of itself. So how do we start using mindfulness then to expand our emotional awareness? Well, there's a model of mindfulness, which again, all of these are topics I can get into in way more detail. But basically, we can begin to acknowledge that in any situation, they're just different things to be aware of. They're different parts of our experience that go into that moment in time. They often seem like one big messy mess. I was going to use profanity there, but I chose not to. So, just one big mess. This is a bad day. It's what it feels like. But actually, we can begin to notice there's different components to that. So one of the fundamental experiences of contemplative practice, of practicing mindfulness, is being aware of our body, being aware of the physical sensations in our body. And we can begin to notice multiple things that as we work with our body and are more doing practices focused that way, that can just be a stress reduction technique in and of itself. But when it comes to emotion and we're practicing meditation and we're just exploring this in everyday life, we can build an awareness that our emotions are often felt in our bodies. And that helps us manage them. If we can begin to, as we're practicing, recognize that when I feel this way, that tends to mean I'm anxious, or that tends to mean I'm angry, or whatever else. I saw an interesting study just in the last couple of weeks that some component of the physical experience of emotion is actually cross-cultural. Like if you ask different cultures to physically locate different emotional sensations, it's actually similar across even different cultures in that way. And this is sort of foundational to all of mindfulness practice, because as I mentioned to you when I was leading the practice, if we're aware of our body, we're not caught up somewhere else. For all the places that our thoughts and emotions can go in life, our body is always here, and it's not meant to be, anything more complicated than that. And then through that awareness, we can begin to get in touch with our emotions and recognize that that tightness in my chest means, anger, or that, when my facial expression feels all crunched up, that means, something else. And we can begin to see, by the way, that becomes interpersonal, because other people see that too. Once we begun to explore the fact that we are sitting and noticing and labeling our emotions, and then we're noticing how it feels in our body and maybe working with that a little bit, we can also recognize that thoughts and stories are part of how we relate to emotions. We have stories about what we're supposed to be feeling or not supposed to be feeling, or our stories put us on this train of fear, into the future or the past. And just like that's the vicious cycle around stress, we can begin to break those cycles just through the practice. You notice, there I am ruminating again, and say, oh, rumination, and come back to the breathing practice. And that might seem a little, a lot of these practices are sometimes described as simple, but not easy. It's like, obviously it's an intention to set. I could tell you on a very personal level that getting out of rumination is not so easy as just coming back to the next breath, but also that having practiced for decades, it's getting easier and easier over time to recognize, like, oh, those are the thoughts. Like there's a well-established program, for example, in England called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy for the treatment of depression. They use it as part of government health there, from what I understand. And part of what they've studied in that program, for example, is that in people with a tendency to cycle into mild to moderate depression, this is not meant for the treatment of more serious depression, that one of the things that happens is they start to feel down, and then the stories they tell themselves about that sort of drive them into a deeper trough. I can't believe this is happening again. And if only I'd been exercising more like I said I would, then it wouldn't have happened. And it becomes this cycle that keeps them, in this trough of mood for longer. So we can begin to notice that in addition to whatever's going on in emotion and body, there's a cognitive pattern. There's a story we're telling, and we can work with those stories too. If this seems a little abstract, it certainly has been studied, but I'm going to organize it into a practice in just a moment, end with a couple of minutes on self-compassion, and come open up for questions in just a few minutes. But this has been studied, and this is a functional imaging study by, I believe, Sarah Lazar out of Harvard, who showed that after just an 8-week program, which isn't that long on the scale of life, there was physical growth in parts of the brain responsible for emotional regulation in this particular study that they did, comparing the people who didn't do mindfulness to the people who did do mindfulness. So, I like tying into science a little bit because hopefully for many of you, this just sounds like common sense and something that works. But for others of you who are more skeptical about it, there's a lot of research about it too, including a study. There is at least one study specific to mindfulness, emotion, and ADHD in kids down to age 7. So what we can do then to use this practice in a valuable way around emotion is frame it as a practice of awareness. Again, it's a gym program. It's every day. I'm going to sit for, well, it doesn't have to be every day. Regularly is a better way of saying it. I'm going to consistently practice a few minutes of awareness, noticing that there might be some discomfort right now. Right now I'm feeling whatever emotion comes to mind, and then just settling and just pausing and realizing I don't have to act on that right now. I'm noticing the urge to compulsively do what I typically do, and I'm giving myself permission to come back. And if there's one thing to take away around emotion, just to remember to organize this in your thinking and to make a practice of it around emotion, there's a practice called RAIN, which is usually attributed to a teacher named Tara Brach. And the RAIN practice, when we're working with emotion, is broken into sitting and then trying to recognize. And again, by the way, if you do this in meditation practice, you can actually use it in everyday life too. See if you can recognize, you can name the emotion. Right now I'm feeling this. This is what, or a better way to say it is actually, this is the experience of, you don't have to over-identify with it. Emotions come and go. So this is the experience of sadness. This is anxiety. See if for a few minutes you can just allow it to be. I have to say from experience, and most of you have probably experienced this too, that, that habitual thing we do around emotion could be useful, and then it's perfectly cool to do it, but quite often it's not so useful. So we want to allow it to be for just a minute. The I stands for investigate. Like, just settle for a second. Is this really what I'm feeling? Or is there more to it than that? Or more components? Or is it changing already? And then the last one is nurture, which is to recognize that we're often really down on ourselves, really harsh on ourselves. Sometimes the N is actually interpreted as non-identification, like I just alluded to a moment ago. But I think nurture is much more practical. Like, how would you talk to a friend in this moment? Wow, this has been a really, really bad day. One of my favorite teachers, one of my earliest teachers, Sylvia Borstein, used to try to, she said her practice was to try to frame it like her grandma used to talk to her in bad moments. Like, oh, sweetheart, that sounds really, really rough. And if that sounds cliched or difficult, just let it go. But there is a way to just get into a mental habit, as I'm going to talk to next, that's a little more compassionate, a little less down on ourselves. And that's quite important to focus on around ADHD. So in terms of emotional practice, pulling together most of today's talk, we want to reframe contemplative practice, reframe mindfulness practice into just an ongoing development of the traits that we choose instead of the sort of reactive autopilot life pushes us into, so that we just get a little better at recognizing and then pausing and being intentional around our emotions. One thing that impacts our emotions, though, which I'm going to end with for a few minutes and then take questions, is the elephant in the room of self-criticism. I think it's a fascinating teaching around mindfulness that going back 2,500 years, there are teachings about something called self-doubt or the inner critic. It's part of inner nature. It's part of human nature. But with ADHD, where the experience is often one of shame, like a book I was just asked to read, or self-criticism, or Dr. Barkley, who summarizes it as not a disorder of not knowing what to do, but a disorder of not doing what you know. That chronic experience of the inner critic is also going to undermine resilience and mindset. The analogy I sometimes use for the inner critic is like Waldorf and Statler, the two old men up in the balcony of the Muppets who are always going to have something negative to say no matter what's going on. And what we can begin to recognize is the inner critic seems hardwired, but it's just another mental habit. And we can look at the fact that, if you were doing a webinar for 1,100 people and totally flubbed a line and misspoke, if it was you on screen, your first thought would probably be something you can all fill in the blank and reflect for a moment. I can't believe I did that. I always do that. Everyone's watching. This is going to go viral, whatever it is. If it was your best friend who was in that same moment, what would you do? you would probably say, it's okay. These things happen. Pause a second, explain yourself. It's all going to work out fine. We're going to sort it out. And it turns out, through research that started primarily through Kristen Neff at the University of Texas, Austin, that something called self-compassion practice can fundamentally change how we relate to moments of struggle and can improve how we feel about ourselves, how we problem solve, and even how we treat other people. And I wanted to talk about this in a talk on emotion because so often that inner critic is driving our inner emotional world. We're overly harsh on ourselves. We're constantly shooting on ourselves. We're constantly critical in ways we would never treat anybody else. And this is really not meant to be extreme. It's not that we're putting ourselves in a place where we're better than everyone else around us or more deserving than everyone else around us. But with practice, we can learn to treat ourselves with the same perspective we treat other people. We're all flawed. We all make mistakes, and we want to approach life that way. But with practice and repetition, we learn to relate to the inner critic differently, and that fundamentally changes our experience in ways that allow us to be more persistent and problem solve differently and recover from mistakes more easily and just live a happier life. So I want to lead a very short self-compassion practice before wrapping up for today. And yeah, I think that's enough. I think I'll lead it and then we'll talk about it. So find yourself a comfortable posture again, just for a few minutes. And begin to pay attention again to that physical sensation of your body moving with each breath. Nothing you're trying to make happen in particular. Nothing you can do right or wrong. And at the start of the practice, what I want you to do is with each in-breath, bring to that in-breath a sense of wide open awareness, allowing yourself to acknowledge everything that's going on. That's an act of self-compassion in and of itself. It's giving yourself permission to just acknowledge this is what's going on right now. This might be a great moment. It might be a really challenging moment in time. It certainly is for many of us right now. So this is everything happening for me, in with awareness. And then for the next part of the practice, we acknowledge that when things are really difficult, we often isolate ourselves. We often retreat into this sense of like, I'm the only idiot who, or whatever else. So the second part of the practice is referred to as common humanity. And on each out breath, I want you to focus on whatever phrase captures for you. Everybody has these moments. Everybody has their struggles. So in with awareness, this is my experience right now. And out, just reminding yourself, everybody has times like this. Or if you like, everybody with ADHD does, or whatever feels right for you right now. And then in the last part of the practice, in an unforced way, really just a reminder, we wish for ourselves whatever we would wish for a friend. So it might just be, may I stay kind with myself right now? Or may I stay strong and at ease? Letting go of striving or comparison, just a reminder of this is how I would treat a friend right now, or what I would wish for a friend right now. And when you're ready, opening your eyes. So thank you all for sharing that with me today. I just want to summarize for just a moment and then take questions. The intention here is to try to make all of this as accessible as possible. The intention of contemplative practice is simply that anything we practice repetitively becomes more habitual in life. And for example, that self-compassion practice doesn't erase the inner critic, but we might get into a routine of when we notice it, reminding ourselves of something that's alternative and something different instead. I'm feeling myself getting caught up in the inner critic. It's okay. This happens to everybody. Let me just come back, and that becomes a habit over time if we practice it. It allows us to manage ADHD differently because we're more self-forgiving and we're less critical and we problem solve more easily. And all these things can fall into place if we start from a foundation of resilience and self-compassion and self-regulation. I did want to mention, I appreciate ADDitude allowing me to mention on the way out that if anyone wants actually just to be in the Catskills in the height of fall, which is pretty awesome. I'm up there a lot in the fall. It's pretty spectacular. The place is a resort. But if anyone wants an immersion in everything to know about ADHD and these practices of emotional regulation, that's what the weekend in the fall is all dedicated to. So hopefully I can see some of you guys there. And I appreciate your attention and awareness through today. So I will pause and turn it over to Ani for the question and answer.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bertin. Before we start in on the Q&A, I will quickly just thank Inflow once more for sponsoring today's webinar. And I would actually like to share, as a segue before our Q&A, a comment that we received from a listener who said that they began practicing. They have ADHD, and they said they used to have a hair trigger temper. About 20 years ago, they said, I cultivated a regular daily meditation practice. After about just 1 year, a very good friend commented to me that I was a totally different person. And they said there's so many misconceptions about mindfulness, and they just wanted to share that comment. So I thought for those who were wondering, like, what's our end goal here? That seems like a pretty good illustration of what some people have achieved through this practice.
Thank you for sharing that one first. I hope that came across in the talk, but that's exactly it. Through repetition, through practice, these things, definitely change. And I've been practicing a really long time. And, I would certainly tell you that, individually, it's definitely changed my overall anxiety, how I communicate, so many different things.
Wonderful. I wanted to circle back quickly to the survey that we asked at the outset, and we asked people what has gotten in the way if they have tried a mindfulness practice in the past. And the number, I'll go maybe over the top 5 here, and we'll try to touch on those. Number 1 was building mindfulness into my routine. That was more than a quarter of the people listening. And right behind it was making time to practice. So we'll touch on those, but I'll go through the others. Number 3 was, unsurprisingly, boredom. 4 was a lack of guidance. And the 5th was unclear objectives. So I'll start right at the top. Yes. With building it into your routine and making time for it.
Well, this almost relates to the self-compassion practice I just led in a little bit, because one of my favorite teaching points around that is all the different curriculum I've studied, and it's been a bunch at this point, or at least gotten to read. Week 1 is the recommendation, we get started with practice, and week 2, literally in writing, is talking about why so many people didn't get started with practice. So it's important to normalize the fact that getting started with habits is just hard for everybody, and actually harder with ADHD because of the impact of executive function. So those, the answer to, like, how do you actually remember to practice mindfulness is really tied just to the science of habit formation and getting habits started in any way for everybody, and certainly, with ADHD. So that means we just have to go back to the basics of like what actually works. And what works is, if it's not scheduled, it's not happening, is a great message around ADHD. So it's scheduling at a specific time. Habit pairing is really useful. So find a habit you're already doing regularly, which could just be like, I go to sleep every night or I wake up every morning, and tying it directly to something you're already doing. Accountability buddies are really helpful. Find somebody else who's going to hold you to it. Use alarms and reminders. There's no miracle to it as much as acknowledging, like, this is really hard to get started with. It's normal that it takes years to get into a really, really consistent routine. It's almost like the same message. Like during meditation practice, the message is like, the distractions, of course, are going to happen. So it's a moment of success each time you come back. And getting started with a meditation practice, it's like, of course, it's hard getting started with anything new. So you're going to get started, and then life's going to get busy for a while, and you're going to forget, and then you come back and you do it again, and you rejigger things so that it's a little more structured. And the finding time of it is really an interesting one, because I think since mindfulness means awareness, we can be aware of the fact that life can feel intensely and impossibly busy an awful lot of the time. But for most of us, if we pause and with sort of unbiased awareness look at our day, there probably is 10 minutes we're wasting somewhere that could be time for meditation. So with awareness, we can sort of carve out the 10 minutes, and with sort of a sense of habit formation and what actually supports new habits, and kindness, and realizing it's difficult, most of us can also establish a consistent meditation practice.
Wonderful. A number of people asked about the study that you cited, the 8-week study. They wondered, were there findings from that regarding the duration of practice? And similarly, a lot of people saying they actually got started just doing 3 to 5 minutes a day. Is that enough? Is that good?
Well, it's being studied more and more. I think it's a very Western way of looking at things, because it's not traditionally, the amount hasn't been studied as intensely it has been in this country, and that's great. I mean, the more detail, the better. The answer is any amount is good. It's about habit formation. It's just about doing it until it becomes routine. I don't actually recall off the top of my head which specific version of mindfulness they used in that particular study. But I do know the most famous research being quoted around this lately is a researcher named Amishi Jha, which is a different body of research, has found changes in as little as 12 minutes a day of meditation. And it could be less. It's just that's as little as she's gotten to. So it's always about the consistency. One of my best friends who teaches contemplative practice like I do, constantly saying to people, it is far better to do just a few minutes a day consistently than like an hour every once in a while. Just get into the routine, and you can always build onto it later if you choose to.
Okay. I feel like that's important for a lot of people to hear. Also, do we have to be still? Can I begin while I'm walking the dog to focus on my breath, for example?
100. I think I said that somewhere in the talk. I know I did. Mindfulness does not mean sitting still. So walking meditation is awesome. Absolutely just a brilliant way to practice. In many, many ways, it's a little more nuanced. You don't even have to focus on your breath, by the way. It could be just the feeling of your feet on the floor. It's kind of an open awareness when you do walking meditation, because you don't want to like fall into a manhole. So it's a slightly different practice walking, but absolutely walking counts. Yoga counts. There's eating meditation. So yoga counts, by the way, if you make it a mindfulness practice, because I do think yoga can be led as a kind of gym program, which has a lot of physical value. But movement practice is really a wonderful, flexible way to do mindfulness for sure. So definitely feel free to explore that as well. And I have a lot of both one of the questions in the poll was finding good resources. I intentionally keep a mindfulness page on my website, because it has both my practices on it, but also links to places you can find good practices, because there's so much out there, it can get pretty confusing. So definitely walking practice is great. You don't have to do breathing practices. Even when you're sitting still, you can do body scan practices and compassion practices. I mean, just explore it all until you find what works for you.
Great. And for those listening, we will provide a link to that resource page on Dr. Bertin's website, as well as a couple of people were asking for the link for the retreat. So cool. You will receive all of that good stuff in the wrap up that you'll receive in email after the event. Okay. So number 3 on our list of roadblocks was boredom. Now, I'd like to wrap this into a question that we received a lot, and that is from parents who say, when they try to introduce the concept to their kids or teenagers, the response they get is, no way, that's so boring. So how can we get our kids and our teenagers to give it a shot?
Right. Those are 2 different questions, definitely, because I would talk about it totally differently with an adult, and we could do a whole seminar just on how to introduce this to kids. As an adult, the major reframe that's important is that the boredom is fine. The boredom is what you're working with. You're learning, in essence, like if it's boredom you're experiencing, what's it like to be bored? and not do whatever you typically do to distract yourself when you're bored, which, might be healthy, might be unhealthy, just like any other emotional experience. So that it could be boredom, it could be anxiety, it could be hunger. It's more physical experience. It could be, physical discomfort within reason that you're going to learn to work with, because, we all have some physical aches and pains, and some of them we can do something about and some of them we can't. And so the number one reframe is to remember that you are capable of, for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, noticing like, this is pretty boring, and that's okay. I'm bored, and I'm going to come back to the breath, and now I'm getting restless, and I'm going to come back to the breath, because we're initially trying to develop patience and awareness. Now, honestly, another layer of the practice we often get to is kind of exploring things with a sense of curiosity, which is a little bit of an open-ended thing to end with today, but it does sometimes change what feels boring. Like we're out in nature and it seems boring, but there's nothing going on. And then if we can just settle and start exploring, maybe it isn't as boring as it seems on first pass. So as an adult, you just fully acknowledge the boredom and almost turn towards it. And that's what you're learning to do, is sit with discomfort a little bit. With kids, it really has to do, the analogy I use a lot with kids is it's like teaching tennis, in that, you have to be not a tennis pro, but you have to know a little bit more than them about contemplative practice, about mindfulness practice. And then, you have to reframe it in a way that they're going to buy in. And that does mean acknowledging, yeah, it's kind of boring, but, trying to think of, I've done this a couple of times this week. I had a great discussion with a teenager who had been resisting. And then she said during conversation, like, my dorm is so busy. I wish I could just find a way to just like, for a little, find a way to find a little quiet in all of that once in a while. And I was able to say, like, well, we've talked about mindfulness before. Let me reframe it for you. Maybe you can notice that, your mind gets busy, and when there's a lot of people around, that spins us into a lot of thinking, and it can feel really overwhelming. So, would you like to do this practice where we focus just on, I think it was feet on the floor, just a moment in the middle of it of just like my mind spinning. And in that moment, that clicked for her. So if you're going to work with kids, you want to just know mindfulness enough to know what developmentally is meeting them where they are individually in a way that makes some sense. For example, in younger kids, doing a body scan during bedtime can be just a beautiful way to know. You don't even have to call it mindfulness. You're lying there, you notice your feet, you relax your feet, you notice your legs, you relax your legs. I have a body scan for kids up on the Insight Timer for free. And, if you want to check that out, and you don't have to even call it mindfulness, but that's in a mindfulness practice. And it's making it kind of normal, because it really feels during bedtime like something that might be useful. You don't have to make a big deal of it. So that's really, you just have to acknowledge, yeah, of course it's a little boring. This isn't how we live most of the time. But then you have to tie it to their life experience and say like, oh, but, let's try this other thing, and there's a lot of wonderful picture books about it, and, more grown-up books as kids get a little bigger. But, if you are familiar with mindfulness yourself, mindfulness in family always starts with adult practice. So if you are familiar with it yourself, you'll know how to make it more engaging to your kids, just by, finding those little hooks based on their life experience.
Mm-hmm. Would you, a number of people here today were asking about how to sort of deploy mindfulness in real time when they feel their emotions triggered. Is there a way to use it almost out loud so that your kids can view like, oh, mom is regulating her emotions right now?
I love that question. And the answer is yes, and yes to both. So, the intention is always to just discover for yourself a framework that works. So for example, if you do the RAIN practice regularly, I'll answer the question in two parts. You might, as an individual, internally be able to, like, even in the middle of a board meeting, just go through the checklist in your head, and you might, this is the emotion I'm feeling, you just, RAIN, and you go through it step by step, and no one else knows you're doing it. And that's one way to use these practices to manage emotion. It's 100% the goal is not to meditate. The goal is to build this routine up so that in everyday life, you are getting better at notice emotion, pause, settle, and just developing that as a routine with a lot of compassion, because it takes time for most people to do that. Although that was a wonderful lead quote to the Q&A. A year isn't that long on the scale of things. And then absolutely, there is nothing better for kids than when parents acknowledge emotions and just talk through, like, this is what I'm doing. I'm feeling kind of angry right now. I'm going to take a walk and then I'll come back and talk about this. I'm feeling really anxious right now. I just want to sit here. I'm going to take a few breaths, and then we can do whatever. Whatever it is, 100%. The more you just acknowledge emotions are part of life, put them out on the table, make sure it's really clear that all emotions are valid. Separating emotion from behavior is so important. It's like, it's okay to be angry. It's not okay to hit. You're in trouble for, the hitting part, but I understand you're angry. All of that is stuff that kids totally benefit from if we just put it out there, and just make it part of their life experience.
Wonderful. I'm taking that as my personal to-do from today's session, Dr. Bertin. Okay. So unfortunately, we are out of time, but Dr. Bertin, thank you so much for joining us today, for really explaining the benefits and practices of mindfulness, and also guiding us so that we can get our feet wet here.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I hope people found it useful. And feel free to track me down through my website if anyone has any follow-up questions or anything else.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who was listening and submitting the questions today. If you would like to access the event resources, you can visit ADDitudemag.com and search podcast 565. The slides and recording will be posted and shared with you just a few hours after we wrap up the live webinar. And if you're listening in replay mode, you can simply click on the episode description. Please know our full library of ADDitude webinars is available as a podcast. It is called the ADHD Experts podcast, and it's available on most streaming platforms. We will be taking a break next week for the July 4th holiday, and we will be back on Thursday, July 10th, with a webinar titled A Self-Confidence Toolkit for Parents, How to Counteract ADHD Criticism for Your Child. So make sure you don't miss future ADDitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at ADDitudemag.com/newsletters. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. We hope to see you again soon.